Thank you for coming to my talk. I absolutely love being in Zagreb. I think this is an amazing conference, and I am very happy to be here. Before I carry on, I have to give you a flashing content warning. So my slides include a lot of GIFs, and if you're photosensitive, it might be uncomfortable. So I just want to let you know now. So I'm Dora. I'm mostly front-end developer, and I spend my time coding in JavaScript and like a small handful of other languages. And I work at a global news organization that's recognized for its authority and integrity and accuracy, and it's the Financial Times. And I've been there for about a year and a half now, and it's been an amazing experience. I recently led the team implementing the GDPR on ft.com. I'm still here. And now I work on an internal products team, so I'm building an app that does like data-driven decision-making for corporate client managers. That's also very exciting. But perhaps my favorite thing about the FT is that they have a great engineering culture. And it is honestly one of the most inclusive and supportive and positive environments that I've worked in. And I'm surrounded by people who are very smart and very kind, and they're always patient and generous with their time and knowledge and experience. And we're a pretty tight bunch. So earlier this year, we went camping in the desert in Spain for a week, and we went to a burn. So for anyone here who's not familiar with Burning Man, a burn is a community-based arts event, and it is strongly based around core principles like self-reliance, self-expression, and inclusion. And this is us. These are my colleagues. So somehow we also managed to attract every single other developer on a 2-mile radius. So most late mornings were spent huddled around in our camp, hungover and talking about tech. And this one morning I will remember, because there were lots of new faces around. I sort of groggily stumbled out of my tent, and the conversation was like, I love React, let's use React for everything. So I'm like, I'm going to make a cup of tea, I can't deal with this. But as I was making tea, I must have missed something really good, because there was just riotous laughter. So I turned around and I'm like, hey, what did I miss? And someone just said, oh, I was telling a joke, but don't worry, you wouldn't get it. And my colleague said immediately, without giving me time to react, oh, she's an engineer too, actually. So like, okay, what led this person to make that assumption? Is it me? Is it the fact that maybe there aren't enough women in tech, so that the default assumption is to assume that woman in a group of engineers is definitely not an engineer? I don't know. So we talked about it in the group, and it turns out that, yeah, the default assumption is there because there aren't enough women in tech, and this is especially obvious outside of Europe and outside of the US. And you know, I'm white, I'm able-bodied, I'm heterosexual, I'm cisgendered, and you know, that's a lot of privilege. And I'm aware that it sort of shields me from a lot of negative assumptions and harassment that other people who are less fortunate have to deal with. So yeah, we're not a very inclusive industry. And it's made me think about previous experiences that I had. So for example, the first ever web performance meetup that I went to, about 2-3 years ago. So I was late. I'm always late. I entered the room, and the free seats were at the back, so I sat down. I felt a bit wimpy. I didn't feel like I had clever enough questions to ask. I kind of skipped out on the beer bit because I don't drink beer, and also everybody else seemed like they knew each other, and I was very new, and there wasn't someone I could immediately just walk up to and say hi to. So I don't know if anyone can relate to this. This has kept happening to me. Another time I went to a panel, and it was the IATF working group for Quick. And I was late. This time the free seats were at the front, so I sat down in the front, and people were taking photos of the event. Someone tweeted a picture, and the first response was, where are the women? So, and I was quite obviously and visibly, and for the first time publicly, the only woman there. And wild guess here, it's probably not because female engineers find multiplexed stream transport over UTP boring. It's not that. Okay, like one more story. I have very good timing. And this happened about the same time when I joined the FT, and it was a career change for me. I was a technical product owner who became a developer and moved to the FT. And it was maybe a few weeks after that an internal memo was leaked. And it was written by someone called James Damore, who was a Google employee at the time. In a nutshell, the memo argued that there are psychological and physiological differences between men and women that explain why female engineers are fewer and less likely to succeed in tech. So obviously this set the internet on fire. And as you can imagine, this sort of statement didn't do me a lot of good with my new job confidence. Yeah. But if there was a silver lining, it got everybody talking about diversity, and it got a lot more perspectives in than before, and a lot greater depth. And the issue of lack of diversity in tech for the first time was a hot topic, and it shot into the public sphere overnight. And that was good, because it meant that we collectively acknowledged that there was a problem, and acknowledging a problem is getting closer to fixing it. But I think a good start in actually fixing the problem is trying to understand the main discussion points. So I want to take a closer look at the whole diversity debate and look at the dialectic and why it's so polarizing and what people commonly talk and think about, and also see what's helpful and what isn't. So firstly, I noticed that people talk about numbers a lot. So it's only fair that I start with the Financial Times. Now, it's just my personal experience, but I think that the FT prize a safe and inclusive working environment. But how diverse are we really? Globally, there's an almost even gender split amongst all staff. So actually, there are slightly more women. And at board level, female representation is 36%, which is actually higher than the UK government target of 33% by 2020. And by 2022, the Financial Times have committed to having a 50-50 gender split in the senior leadership team. And that's what's known as a diversity quota. And whenever I mention diversity quotas, this is what tends to happen because people have strong feelings about quotas. And yeah, there's a good argument that diversity quotas are inherently anti-meritocratic, because why would you have, it seems a bit arbitrary to have numeric requirements for hiring and promoting people based on gender, race, ethnicity. And yeah, therefore talking about it is a bit of a minefield. And I've read and heard so many stories about, oh, this person was only hired because they're a token minority of some kind, and even accusations. And kind of bringing up that conversation never ever led to a good place in my experience. But by far, I think the biggest problem with quotas is the fact that they can trick us into thinking that our job is done. Like, okay, we've hit a number, we've solved the problem, nothing else to do, boom, no more inequality, and it's not that simple. So I'm going to give an example here, and it's to do with one of my favorite TV shows, which is Mad Men. It's an American TV show. It's about an ad agency set in the late 50s, early 60s. The ad agency is called Sterling Cooper, and they have perfect gender parity. Every man has a secretary. So yeah, you can't even take a company's diversity statistics at face value, because you always have to ask some extra questions to find out how the balance really tips. Like, hey, what's your pay gap? In the UK, 9 out of 10 women work for a company that pays them less for the same job. And half of men work for a company where the gender pay gap is more than 10% in their favor. So these numbers are huge, and we're not alone. So yeah, it's important to recognize that diversity quotas are flawed, and talking about numbers without any other considerations isn't going to get you anywhere. But before you completely dismiss the topic, you need to ask 2 questions. First of all, do we really live in a society where privilege plays no part in opportunity? Do we live in a society where merit truly equals ability plus effort? And the answer is definitely no. And as long as that is true, diversity quotas are necessary, but not sufficient. And they are necessary because they may be the only way of achieving a society where they're obsolete. Cool. So I read this interesting book recently, and the book challenges the common assumption that technology is gender neutral. And Judy Weitzman, in Feminist Confronts Technology, argues that there is male bias in the way that technology is defined and then developed. And this is a traditional feminist line of argument, in that technology plays an important part in men and in how men have reached and maintain their power, and how this all reinforces sexual divisions in society. This book was published in 1991. Some parts of it are still relevant, but it's 2018, and I think we need to kind of shift the conversation. We're used to talking about men and women because we spent thousands of years shaping and rationalizing gender roles, but that's not really on anymore. Because demographics are a spectrum, they're not binary. And if you talk about diversity along one dimension like gender, then you're really fighting for a diversity that unequally benefits one group of people over another. And this diversity disregards the challenges at the intersection of being, say, a woman and a person of color, or a person with a disability and non-binary. So the kind of diversity that is worth fighting for, I think, is the kind of diversity that enables more people from different races and backgrounds, cultures, walks of life, people of any and no gender, to rub shoulders, from VC pitches to fashion shows. And maybe one day this will mean that working class kids won't have to have working class jobs, and none of us, and more of us, can lead lives that are free of discrimination and stigma. So that kind of diversity is definitely worth fighting for. But why is it important anyway? If you Google why is diversity important in tech, you'll get like a bazillion articles, and they're all the same: because it's good for business. And yeah, sure, the laws of economics and countless studies of diversity, and to an extent common sense, say that if you really tap into your whole human resource pool and use up all that talent, then collectively our performance will improve. And there are some more specific studies I could talk about with sample sizes of hundreds of companies from the likes of BCG and Deloitte that conclusively show that companies that are more diverse along many variables, ethnicities and gender, outperform their peers in terms of innovation and in terms of financial performance. And there are also studies that show the opposite. So I believe it was McKinsey who found that companies who are the least diverse underperform financially in their industries by up to 25% below the median, which is huge, right? The trouble is, statistics like this are great for getting executive buy-in, but not great for much more. And to paraphrase a colleague, it's good for business is what you give to people who are so uninterested in making the world better for anyone but themselves that it's good for business is all you have. And it's good for business probably won't make a difference to your opinion or mine, unless you own a business. I don't. And it doesn't help with fixing unfairness and inequality, and it won't help you build a diverse workplace from the ground up. And also it's kind of boring to talk about. Because as someone outside of your company, I don't care if it needs me or people like me to be better itself. What I care about and what I want you to understand is that I'm looking at this through a social justice lens, because caring about diversity requires a moral argument that acknowledges that we live in unequal times. And there's systemic inequality in access to education, access to employment, and we have persistent bias, persistent stereotypes around race, wealth, social class. And our very institutions, anything from education to healthcare to welfare to politics, come with unequal outcomes built in, which benefit some people more than others, and that's a fact. So if you think about it, diversity statistics are a good barometer for social justice and equality in general. And the more people understand that in all its nuances, then the better chance we have to change as a society. So, like, by all means, talk about diversity from a social justice standpoint, because ignorance is part of the oppression. No one will argue with that. Who can argue with that? Like, okay, maybe bad people, ignorant people, but good people like you and me will just acknowledge that, yeah, diversity problems contribute to inequality and are in turn caused by inequality. And we'll educate ourselves about how we can do something about it. Except good people like you and me don't always do good. Sometimes we do or say things not for their intrinsic value, but because of what they say about us. And that's called virtue signaling. So a lot of this happens on social media, especially on Twitter, that I've noticed. Virtue signaling is basically showing others how right on you are. And that often comes from a position of privilege. And it is just that, it is talking about it. So there's a lot of this self-congratulatory focus on diversity, and it's unhelpful. And often it's so noisy that we tend to forget that maybe whatever gains we've made might be slipping or aren't sufficient. So you really can't be naive and idealistic about it, because the space between caring and not giving a damn is in a follow-up, and purpose is nothing without considered implementation. Anyway, I saw Tim Kadlec speak at Delta V, which is a web performance conference in London, and he said something that really stuck with me. He says that change from the top down is rarely altruistic. And it didn't stick with me because of the altruism. It gave me a new perspective. How can I think about diversity from a selfish point of view? Diversity of thought and experience, that's something that most of us strive for through our experiences in life, through our pursuits, through the people we connect with, through what we seek out, right? Most of us are interested in enriching our own lives. Compared to everything else, a lot of us will spend the disproportionate amount of time at work for a significant portion of our lives. And we come to trust our colleagues, and we gravitate into these circles of trust and tend to rely on one another to share ideas and make decisions and go through hardship and tackle problems and socialize. And we have leaders to which we turn to for support, and we relish their support. And whenever we can, we offer our support to others, be it at work or beyond. And we give emotional support and make friends and form cliques. In other words, we naturally create networks, informal, sometimes social networks. And networks were the subject of study of this guy called David Krakauer, who was a professor of cognitive sciences at Carnegie Mellon. And he studied the way that people are connected at work has an influence over the performance of the organization as a whole. And something fun about networks is that you can use network data and graph theory to analyze them. So I came across this study in Harvard Business Review, which was underpinned by network data gathered from surveying all employees of a large organization. And they were asked things like, whom would you trust to discuss concerns about work? Whom would you ask to support a proposal of yours that could be unpopular? With 1 day of training, whose shoes might you be able to step into? So they collected all this network data and they mapped it onto directed graphs representing the various informal networks within the company. They also mapped gender onto the nodes. So I ran the simulation with the FT's senior leadership statistic of 34% female representation, and I ran it a few times and there wasn't any variance, but for argument's sake, I just took this one. And imagine that we need to make an important decision here, and pick an orange node for the CTO, and try and traverse the graph and ask yourself, how many women are likely to be involved in this decision-making chain? So you're going to say, obviously, yeah, there are less women, so not that many, but there's something else at play there. And in the study I read, the decision-making network had 14% more same-gender ties than would be expected without giving consideration to gender. And the innovation-sharing network had 22% more same-gender ties. Women were more isolated, less central, and that just means that fewer people seek them out to discuss new ideas. And the hypothesis is that no matter what your gender split is, you will still have a disproportionate ratio of same-gender ties. Why is that? Because if diversity is bricks, something called inclusion is mortar. And it turns out we are, by virtue of human nature, not very good at that. We have biases. We have subtle biases. We gravitate towards people like us, which can lead to exclusion and self-exclusion, like taking back seats at web performance meetups. Minority groups try to conform, often just to cope or to avoid being stereotyped. They de-emphasize their otherness. They adopt the traits of the majority, because we as a society portray the majority as a prototype for success. So effectively, we either exclude or assimilate minorities. Which reminds me of an old ad campaign from '02. It featured cats. It was like, be more dog, except in our case, the pack, which is the majority, puts up resistance because they perceive reverse favoritism and feel excluded from diverse initiatives. You can't be more dog. So minorities face all this bias and stereotype threat and empathy gaps, ambition gaps. We're constantly bombarded with societal cues, which we internalize. And your career progression often depends on taking risks, and it's often not at the forefront of your mind when you feel like you have to be grateful for even having a seat at the table, and a seat is much less comfortable if you feel tolerated rather than included. So if diversity is being invited to a party, inclusion is being glad you're there. And there's not much good in having diversity without inclusion. How are we doing in tech? Stack Overflow Dev Survey this year, they asked developers how they assess potential jobs. A vast majority of 30.4% said that diversity was their lowest priority. And different types of developers have different priorities when they consider jobs. So gender minorities rank the company culture and office environment highest. The other 90-something% rank pay highest. So we don't care, we haven't even got the basics. And this survey made me sad. But before we all emigrate to the moon, I'm gonna answer the obvious question, like how? How are we gonna break down these barriers and make it possible that we have a truly inclusive tech industry? And we can start by admitting that there are things in our power that we can and should be doing. Okay, start by understanding your own bias, because we're all biased, and then seek to assess your privilege and keep it in check. Hey, you can use a website called Project Implicit to find out your implicit biases about anything from gender, sexual orientation, race, and other topics. Then hire people. I'm trying to hire them from underrepresented groups. And this is super hard for anyone who has actually tried to do this and been involved in the process, because you'll hit a few barriers. Someone will say, yeah, diversity is important, but we don't want to lower the bar. We don't have a bar. There is no bar. There's an internal study at Google that found that there is no relationship between a hiring manager or an interviewer saying hire and that person being an actually good hire or not. Because no one in tech has a bar that can determine very well good versus bad, regardless of ethnicity or gender or any other diversity variables. That bar is simply a consensus by the majority, which in our case is very homogeneous. Oh, someone will say not enough minorities are applying, and your job is to ask why and then fix it. And a good place to start is job descriptions. You can use tools like Textio that will analyze your job descriptions, find like obvious points for improvement, like using more inclusive language. Okay, so maybe you don't have job descriptions, maybe you don't have a long list of bullet points, maybe you care about people's GitHub profiles or open source contributions, or whether they're good speakers or not. How many underemployed single moms do you think you're gonna hire? Yeah, your job is to build the best team. And you can choose any strategy you want to get there. But if your strategy is simply hire the best person for the role, and it lands you with a less diverse, less strong team, then your strategy is failing and you need to change it. You have to reach out to underrepresented groups and actively seek them out. Like Twitter, most people are on Twitter. Twitter is a good place to start. You also have to remember that minorities often have to prove themselves to a far greater extent than everybody else. Right? There's a study by McKinsey which says that men are promoted based on potential and women are promoted based on past achievements. So you have to support and nurture people. You can't just hire them and let them get on with it. You've got to have their backs. Give recognition. Be a feminist. Become part of the solution by supporting minorities in the workplace and outside and at home. Be an equal parent and be an equal partner. And leave no one out, no matter their gender, ability, race, or class. You have to treat everyone with the same respect, consideration, and tolerance. And that means you have to actively make inclusive workplaces and inclusive conferences and inclusive meetups and inclusive panels and inclusive working groups, and you have to use inclusive language and you kind of code inclusive forms and consider those who don't drink beer or eat pizza. And then speak up, because silence serves no one. Speak up when others can't, because that's really important. They might not have the seniority or confidence to say that there's a problem. Do what you'd do if you weren't afraid. And be bold and aim for the top. So this is going to be scary, but you have to get rid of any internal barriers, and that is critical to gaining power. And it's entirely up to you how you do it, but you have to refuse to be someone you're not. And don't worry if you're uncomfortable, because breaking down these barriers will eventually breed psychological safety for everybody else. If you're a minority, don't just accept the status quo. Take charge, take responsibility for your words and actions, especially as you get further in your career and gain more influence. Because people will listen, so use that privilege to support and boost the people who need it most. Listen to people, pay close attention to marginalized voices. You can use something like Diversify Your Feed, which is a website that tells you how balanced your Twitter sphere is and makes sure you get a broader range of views. Get out of your comfort zone, make new connections, make new friends. Use DonutBot. DonutBot pairs you randomly with someone on Slack for coffee, and you can decide how often you want to do that. Seek to understand the more specific issues that others are facing, but don't make assumptions. You're not a savior. Instead, maybe join some support groups or start some support groups and celebrate diversity. Make it an inclusive celebration for all of us in tech, because tolerating difference is not the same as embracing it. You can tweet this slide if you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dora.